I'm Jason Judd of the Global Labor Institute at Cornell University. GLI is a quantitative research shop in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations here at Cornell. And we're interested in what works on a large scale to improve working conditions in global production. So for us, good data on outcomes for workers and firms, that's a big deal. But getting the right data can be a real struggle. Regulators, investors, unions, campaigners, some lead firms, manufacturers, they all feel some of this. And over the last 3 or 4 years now, Sarosh Kuruvilla and I at the Global Labor Institute have been organizing our thinking about which data matters most and how to get it. And we've boiled all of that down in the last 12 months or so to the 25 labor outcomes metrics that we're going to share with you today, and that we previewed for those of you who joined us here in New York City at the conference in February. And today we're publishing the policy brief, where we make the argument. We present these metrics in full, and we show how regulators and others can use them. Okay, so here's how we're going to organize this session. First, a presentation from Sarosh, about 20 minutes on the basics. We'll follow that another 20 minutes or so with a discussion. And for that, we've invited in Samira Rafaela, a Dutch MEP, a member of the European Parliament, and the penholder for the new EU forced labor ban. Just by the way, Samira is joining the Global Labor Institute for a year as a visiting fellow. This is her first event. Dheeraj, who leads programs at Praxis, and Shahnaz Rafiq of the INTUC, the Indian National Trade Union Congress. And last, James McMichael, who's founder of Mosaic, which helps firms develop and manage labor and sustainability programs. Okay, so we'll get their reactions to Sarosh's presentation, and then questions from you in the audience in the Q&A box. We're recording this. We'll make it available later. Thank you all for joining us. Ready? Okay, Sarosh.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Welcome everybody, and let's get into this. So this, I think, is a watershed moment in regulation, the shift from voluntary private regulation to mandatory public regulation. So we have new plethora of legislations in France, in Germany, in Norway, and in the European Union. And I think in some sense that the fact that all of these are happening at the same time frame reflects policymakers' acceptance of the failure of 25 years of private regulation by companies, which is why we're going public. It is a method to finally hold companies accountable for harms to people and planet in their operations and supply chains. And for the first time, there are significant penalties for violations. In fact, the penalty for violation of the CSRD, which was passed in the European Union in the French part of it, it has fines and imprisonment, whereas in other places it's just fines. And CSDDD allows aggrieved parties to sue in European courts. So there are significant penalties. So this is why I think this is a watershed moment, a fundamental change from the past. Okay, the three implications I want to talk about in this due diligence legislation. The first is companies are going to be held accountable, and they have to identify, assess, mitigate, and prevent their negative impacts. And this is a heavy lift because there's a lot for companies to do. The second is the quality of their intelligence. They need to improve their intelligence about supply chain labor practices. The fact that we did not know is no longer an excuse, right? So you really have to know more about supply chain labor practices, which is why we talk about knowing. And finally, for the first time, these laws require companies to show that they are not the cause of poor labor practices in the supply chain. It is not their purchasing practices that are the cause. And so this is a new wrinkle in the sense that corporations now have to have the management systems to in order to show that they are not the cause. Okay, so it's accountability, the quality of their intelligence, and better management systems. Okay. There are also implications of due diligence laws for reporting. And one of the biggest implications is that, the shift from reporting on inputs, what companies do, to outcomes, what works in the supply chain, for labor outcomes. So I want to highlight a little bit that, the supply chain labor ecosystem was built when we had voluntary private regulation. And a lot of those parts of that ecosystem, whether it was MSIs or auditing companies, etc., were all designed to improve lead firm programs. So if you sort of take the example of ETI in the UK, firms joined ETI in order to get advice about how to improve their programs, but ETI rarely sort of reported about whether those programs were working. Similarly, the Fairware Foundation in the Netherlands also had all these programs to improve their company programs, their member programs, without knowing or without asking whether those programs are improving the lives of workers in the supply chain. The OECD guidelines require companies to report extensively about their policies and programs, but not whether those programs work and whether workers' lives in the supply chain are increasing. The GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, is very similar. An endless description about the company policies, but not about outcomes in the supply chain. So that's a big shift from inputs to outcomes, because now you have to show that your policies work. The second big shift is the shift from private information to public disclosure. Most of the laws in Europe require that companies publish their risk analyses on their website or submit it to the regulation authority, right? So there is this added element of public disclosure as well that changes the way companies report. So this is a big shift as well, because we are in a new era. The old institutions were built for private regulation. We're in a new era for public mandatory regulation and public disclosure. Okay. Now a little bit about our metrics. Our metrics focus on outcomes. And the outcomes that we are most interested in is the actual impact of these programs on workers and workers' lives, because remember, that is our focus. Given that the European laws talk about double materiality, both on the importance of information for the financial side, but also on human people and planet, our metrics are quantitative, and they're very similar. They are parallel in some sense to the financial information, which are also quantitative. Right? So, example, the SEC's 10K reports are quantitative and financial, and so we'd like to make sure that the non-financial labor information is also quantitative. We've people have always told us that, it's very hard to get metrics on labor. It's much easier to get metrics on environmental issues. And we are saying, no, it is fairly easy to get metrics on labor. The third element of our metrics is that they are parsimonious. For the regulator, you just have 25 metrics instead of looking at pages and pages of descriptions of inputs and policies and programs, which is what the OECD guidelines require, the GRI requires. And so it's much easier for anybody, not just regulators, to sort of see the results of these programs. In terms of utility, we were originally making these metrics because we thought regulators and stakeholders would like to see to assess and compare outcomes over time and across suppliers, countries, and tiers. But then we also found, as we started talking to people, that it was particularly useful for lead firms as well, because these metrics are particularly useful to help them analyze risk and report effectiveness and progress. So it's both useful for the lead firms, but also for the wider ecosystem. Finally, it's generalizable to many other industries. We designed them for apparel because we were working in apparel at that time, but most of our metrics are adaptable to other industries. Perhaps the interesting thing is that these metrics are not new. Many companies actually collect this data, not all of it, but some of it. And it's just that even if they collect it, they don't report it. Now, I want to make a final point here, and that is that metrics, why 25? Why not 40? Why not more? And there's always a case for other metrics that could be added. But we wanted to keep this manageable. This captures the most important issues on labor. And so that's why we're 25. I mean, you could make a plausible argument for adding on more metrics, and we've already had people writing to us about, what about this and what about that. But this is a start, and I think it captures most of what we require to know. Okay, moving on. We have metrics in 6 categories here: sourcing metrics, workforce metrics, working conditions, work climate impacts. Those are relatively brand new metrics based on GLI's research, and then representation rights and intelligence audit information. And we want all these metrics reported for 3 years so that you can track progress over time. I'm going to discuss each and discuss some aspects of each of these metrics. Okay, so let's go on to sourcing metrics. We have 5 here. They're all important. And I am discussing these metrics in relation to the German law, largely because the German law has published guidelines. German authorities have published guidance for firms to follow, and the guidance is quite specific. And so we kind of show here how our metrics relate to the German law. So overall sourcing risk, our first metric, is sourcing share by volume by country, and this helps the regulators assess and companies assess risks from country, sector, and product. So if you are sourcing from China, and a large part of your volume is sourced from China, then you know that there is a risk of violations of freedom of association, right? For example. The second metric is sourcing share of production. This is about leverage and relevance. And here the issue is, to what extent do you have influence over labor conditions in the supply chain? So if you're sourcing from a factory where you only have 5% of the production, companies could make a plausible argument that they have relatively little influence. And then the regulator will then sort of take that into account. But if you have a lot of influence, then you are really liable in some sense for conditions in that factory. And so the German law is quite specific that it requires companies to know just how much of production they have in a particular factory. Now, metrics 3 and 4 are both connected with buyer-supplier relationships. And the basic underlying argument here is that long-term, high-quality relationships with buyers invariably are better for working conditions in the supply chain. And there is a lot of research that shows that. And so what our metrics are: order, quantity, value, and volume by factory over time, and the annual change in suppliers over time, and the volume as well. Steady volumes with regular suppliers indicates some confidence in the fact that working conditions would improve. Finally, sourcing and labor performance alignment. This is an important criteria in the German law because it constitutes evidence that companies have the internal management systems that reduce the causal influence of purchasing practices. So what we are interested in is purchase sourcing and compliance integrated inside lead firms. Our research shows that in many companies, they are not integrated. And in many companies who claim they are integrated, the actual data shows that it's not. And this is really crucial because this is the one way in which you can show the regulators that your programs, your internal management systems are working well to incentivize compliance rather than to cause non-compliance. Okay, so those are sourcing metrics. I'm going on to the next category, workforce metrics. Some of these need little explanation. So 6 and 7 are legal status of workers and contingency status of workers. It's important to report the percentage of foreign workers as a percentage of the workforce by factory. And if the percentages are high, then that's the risk for forced labor is also high. For migrant workers, and the same if you high degree of temporary casual workers, the risk for all kinds of labor violations is much higher. Number 8 on worker turnover is interesting because we all know that that if we don't like our jobs, we quit, and that applies to workers as well. And so we did research in a company which had collected in the supply chain annual worker turnover, and we were able to find the causes of turnover. And yes, poor labor conditions and poor pay is a large cause of turnover. So collecting worker turnover data is an indication that labor conditions in the factory may not be all that good. This is voluntary turnover data. Finally, we have gender pay equity. Now, gender discrimination is a core human right, and one of the simplest metrics that you have on gender discrimination is whether women are paid the same as men for doing the same comparable job. And strangely enough, it is not common for companies and auditing firms to collect data on gender pay equity, but we think this is going to be crucial to assess whether a company is at risk of violations in the supply chain. The same thing with gender equity, gender-based violence. If you have a factory with mostly female workers and mostly male management, there is a risk of gender-based violence. And the metric that we are looking at is to what extent the percentage of female supervisors is improving over time and in relation to the percentage of female workers in the factory. Okay, so female supervisors as a share of all supervisors versus female share of total workforce. Okay. Moving on to working conditions metrics. These are relatively self-explanatory, but let me focus on a few. So factory working conditions, these are violations by labor standards category by factory. Most companies collect this information or through auditing. They should have this information readily. Hours and wages as well. These are the usual kind of data that is required through the auditing system these days. But now, if you actually report average monthly production worker pay, then it is easier to sort of analyze whether there is risk of the pay not being equal to minimum wages, or the pay not being equal to living wages, or whatever criteria that the laws specify, and so on. Grievances in particular are important because it is part of the legislation, the German legislation, is the right to remedy. And here I want to highlight that just having a grievance procedure is not enough. The actual metric is whether there is a worker trusted grievance system, right? And if you can show that workers trust the grievance system, then we want to sort of see the number of grievances and calls by factory. So the accent is on, is it worker trusted? And companies would need the intelligence to collect intelligence to show that, maybe through surveys, through interviews with workers, and so on. Moving on rights and representation, I want to focus on 16 and 17 a little bit. So the current freedom of association is, again, a core human right. The current methodology is for auditors to check whether a union exists in the factory. Our argument is that it's not enough, because it is possible that the union could be run by the Communist Party. It's possible that the union could be created by management. So our metric is that the share of workers in activist unions that bargain and challenge management on fundamental issues. So companies would need to collect information on whether the union is genuine and activist, right? Similarly, with collective bargaining agreement, the current methodology is for auditors to check whether there's a collective bargaining agreement, and if there is one, there's a tick mark, and we think that's not enough too, because China has the largest amount of collective bargaining agreements in the world today. So what we are interested in is the share of workers covered by collective bargaining agreements where the provisions are better than state-specified minimums, right? And that's an indicator of genuine collective bargaining. On metric 18, on workplace governance, here the our metric accent is on worker chosen candidates to serve on representation committees. Most factories have various committees, safety committees, health committees, so on and so forth. But the accent is on, are the candidates chosen by workers themselves, and the gender ratio of committee members to the gender ratio of the workforce. It's also important. Fine. Moving on to work climate impact metrics. These metrics we added recently based on GLI's own research about the impact of heat and flooding on workers' lives. Much of the focus of global brands has been on mitigation of their footprint on the environment, but we think that is really important for adaptation to climate change. And strangely enough, there is no international standard about working in hot conditions. There is no ILO convention on heat. Similarly, there is no rules and laws about what happens if there is a flood, and what happens to workers, what happens to their wages, what happens to their working conditions. So we have a system. We have created 5 metrics. One is on indoor measuring temperature standards. When the wet bulb globe temperature exceeds a certain threshold, the wet bulb globe temperature includes heat and is a measure of heat and humidity. And there are rules about how long workers should be working when wet bulb globe temperatures exceeds 30 degrees C. Similarly, flooding. Do factories actually prepare for big flood events? We've had big floods in Pakistan just last year and other places in Bangladesh. Then we're looking at worker health, paid sick days, because all of this climate change has this impact on workers' health. And then what happens if, force majeure, there's a flood and workers can't get to the factory? Do they lose pay? So these are, important issues. Finally, we have some metrics or disclosure. If companies are using auditing as a method of collecting intelligence, we would like those companies to name the audit firm and the auditors, the duration of the audit, the number of person days by factory, because one big criticism of the current auditing regime is that auditors spend too little time, just one man day or one person day in the factory. And then the cost, and who pays the cost of the audit? Is it paid by the lead firm or is it paid by the supplier? And so these are useful contextual information that we think is required. So with that, I will stop my discussion of metrics and pass it back to Jason.
Okay, thank you, Sarosh. Okay, so we want to go right to the panel and get an argument going about what this means for workers, for their employers, for regulators. And let me reintroduce quickly our guests. First, Samira Rafaela, a Dutch MEP and soon to be visiting fellow here at the Global Labour Institute. Dhiraj of Praxis in India, and Shahnaz Rafiq of the INTUC, also in India, and James McMichael of Mosaic. Okay, Samira, let's hear from you first.
Thank you very much, Jason and Sarosh, for the presentation. Welcome to everyone here present. Very, very interesting work, of course. And let me first start maybe also as my former role as the rapporteur on the CSDDD, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive for the Social Affairs and Employment Committee. And my focus back then has been on creating an impact on human rights and the environment, obviously. And therefore, we need strong measurements. I mean, if we want to have strong impact on human rights, labor rights, environment, we need to measure that in a way. So in the proposals I did in my role as rapporteur in the Social Affairs and Employment Committee, there was a strong emphasis on workers' representatives, social partners, accounting for gender sensitivity and mainstreaming, and also adopting a victim-based approach. So we have strongly advocated for providing sector-specific guidelines, training, facilitating network and platform creation for companies. And additionally, the committee has successfully advocated for a gender-responsive approach in the CSDDD. And these conditions are now mainstreamed in the final text. So it is very important that this directive from the EU side engages with affected and vulnerable groups and communities in society as much as possible. We also call it meaningful engagement. And this is where measurement and transparency are very crucial. I mean, if you want to know and determine how we need to engage and what the impact is on communities, vulnerable groups in our society, we need to start measure it. And the new set of labor outcomes metrics is a pragmatic tool, I'd say, for stakeholders to measure impact and also to focus due diligence. And the first crucial step is to outline and establish this within a judicial framework. This is basically what has happened now in the EU, but also with the forced labor ban regulation. But we are soon moving to the implementation phase where competent authorities and member states will need to translate that framework into concrete measurements and actions. And this can really help here. So this new set of metrics can easily, I'd say, facilitate this process. And the challenge for the new EU legislation, both for CSDDD and forced labor, is to go beyond compliance and shift towards sustainable change, with companies becoming partners also in this effort. If we look at the annex in the GOI policy brief, we see a significant lack of reporting on most of the metrics, indicating that many opportunities remain untapped. And it's interesting to note that metrics, for example, in the area of working conditions, which are the most visible and damaging to the image and reputation of companies, are reported on more frequently compared to other measures. That is understandable. But this also means that we need to look and that we have a challenge here when it comes to how can we support and encourage companies to report more comprehensively. And how can we ensure that companies report on the true impact of their business conduct, rather than what they care about or what is more easy to report about. So part of the solution is to create clear metrics and guidelines for companies to report more easily and to implement measures that foster true societal and environmental change. And this is a very interesting, good first step for that. And these metrics can also inspire legislators to identify the gaps that new legislation can fill. So, for example, on the EU Pay Transparency Directive, I was also the lead negotiator on that directive, aims to close the gender pay gap and is directly linked to the metric on gender pay equity. And that's facilitating this measure. So at least for the EU companies, and I think that's also an example of how legislators can look at these metrics and the measures that are still lacking, and to see where they can fill it with new legislative proposals. And then lastly, incorporating these metrics in trade negotiations can be very helpful, I believe, for reforming trade in general. I've been in the trade committee in the parliament, and we have been discussing how we can make trade more value-driven, value-based. We need to do that through rules and measures, and especially when discussing specific chapters in trade agreements or the economic partnerships, this can be a very interesting discussion on how to incorporate these metrics. And it can be a way to make trade work for better labor rights. So far, my first response, Jason. Thank you.
Okay, good. All right, great. Lots of fit there between these metrics and all the policy discussions going on. Okay, let's go now to India and have first Dheeraj and then Shahnaz talk about how these metrics look from their perspective. So first Dheeraj, then Shahnaz, and then finally James.
Thanks. So first, I would like to congratulate the team for such a comprehensive work. It's always difficult to quantify, I would say, when it comes to labor or social indicators, and that's the very reason we see very few comprehensive indices when it comes to social aspects. So it's a welcoming thing, I would say, very pragmatic, as already reiterated. I think generic nature helps because otherwise debate is always about whether it is applicable or not applicable. So it helps when it's generic in nature. Data-wise, I do see a challenge that how much data would be available on these parameters. And I think already it's reiterated that companies might be collecting this kind of data, but they might not disclose in public domain. So how this information will be gathered and will be published becomes one challenge. On positive aspects, I see like freedom of association, collective bargaining, and particularly looking at unions that negotiate is an important aspect, which many times these are critical aspects which we find missing. One part is about we are talking about upstream accountability, but also if on downstream side we can see what is happening, because that's where a lot of global south, global north kind of challenge do emerge. And because anything that we take at an average value, what happens in both upstream and downstream becomes important to understand. That's our experience also says. Now on a reflective mode, so it's I would say it's a very positive thing. On reflective side, when I look at any metrics related developments, it's like if we see environment related developments, and we see there's a meta proxy indicator of temperature rise that is being used. So how, and whenever we fail on that, we know that we fail collectively. So it means somewhere we have failed in our efforts. So, and everybody has to play that responsibility to reverse that indicator. So what is, when we look at social side, or particularly on labor side, then what could be that meta proxy indicator is something that is a matter of reflection. And there are options like in terms of inequities or inequalities that we can look at. So because surely why I feel if we look at the rising inequality, it can lead to rise in political temperatures, probably a lot more than rise in climatic temperature. So somewhere it provides that scope to also look at some of these meta proxy indicators and its possibilities. So I will stop with this.
All right, good. Thank you, Dheeraj. Well, Shahnaz, are you ready?
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead. You're on.
Yeah, great. Well, good day, everyone. And first of all, I would like to congratulate the team for this wonderful metrics measures. On behalf of INTUC and as a trade unionist, how these measures could be taken up. So when we look into that aspect and adding on to what just Dheeraj said, when companies have to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for their adverse impacts on human rights, trade unions now have to take a central stage in due diligence. And they have an important role to play because they need to, first of all, aware the workers. And companies too need to take on board the unions as their important stakeholders. And there should be a transparent and meaningful two-way engagement. We see that brands and suppliers need to engage in collective bargaining to solve the systematic problems in the global supply chain. And you see several countries in the textile and garment supply chain, they do not even have a national or a sectoral minimum wage. Even in the countries where it exists, they are not complied. So to address the imbalances and to redistribute the supply chain costs and profits more evenly is very important. Secondly, I think the global framework agreements are another way to protect the interests of the workers across the multinational company operations. The GFAs are negotiated. And we have seen the example of the Accord of Bangladesh and how it extended to the International Accord. So that is also one very good tool. For the global brands and suppliers to practice due diligence, there needs to be meaningful mutual engagement. In context to India, we see there are new labor codes which have jumped in, and all the joint sector trade unions are trying to scrap up these labor codes. So unions need to get involved, conducting the risk analysis, the preventive measures, corrective actions and remedies, providing training for shop stewards to document violations is essential to build cases against these MNCs. But importantly, they should use the law to conduct strategic organizing campaigns to build a strong union base along the supply chains and develop a strong bargaining power. And this is very important and where we are still lagging behind. Now, to safeguarding the fundamental rights, particularly within the intricate web of global supply chains, we need to collaborate and plan strategically among the unions for effective implementation of human rights due diligence law. And we, as trade unions, we respect business. We want business. But on the other hand, businesses should also respect workers, because workers deserve dignity and not charity. Now, if we take into the recommendations part, we can see that policy mechanisms and implementation details should be included, and it should be shared very transparently. First of all, the companies to review their existence grievances procedures should be fair, transparent, understandable, well publicized, and accessible by all. The grievance redressal system should be linked to the HRDD systems also, which is lacking. We know that there will be certain challenges also to make it applicable in the full supply chain in less established or informal relationships, which has been rightly pointed out by Dheeraj also. To align this approach with the UNGPs and the OECD guidelines and clearly differentiate between the scope of due diligence and leverage and the violations, companies should focus on the most severe wherever they can be found in the supply chain systems in the global value chains. the right to an adequate standard of living needs to be addressed. Corporate standards due diligence is too complicated for smaller companies. It doesn't cover the SMEs, and which are dominant in the garment sector, and does have a severe impact on the people, also in the climate. Supporting companies and the partners in the capacity building is important. Technical guidance, experience sharing, and other actions so as to adapt the CSDDD. Now, women and girls definitely experience the adverse impacts of business activities differently and often disproportionately. They face additional barriers in seeking access to effective remedies due to gender discrimination, social, cultural barriers, and that needs to be addressed also. There are stigmas, lack of knowledge of their rights, as well as economic and educational disadvantages. So gender lens in each step of the due diligence process need to be followed, and due diligence should not be ticking the box exercise. And on behalf of INTUC, we look forward to more collaborative effort. Thank you, Jason, for giving
All right, good.
me
Thank you, Janas. Okay, James, you're last in this round. So we
Hello.
So, yeah, uses for regulators, uses for worker organizations. Could you talk a little bit about how, if brands can make use of these metrics, and to maybe get at what Dheeraj mentioned, the availability of this data. Is this the sort of data, maybe with the exception of the latest, the climate labor metrics, is this data that brands have or should have at hand?
Yeah, sure. First of all, yeah, thanks for inviting me, and also congratulations as well for this work you put out. I think it's really important. First of all, I absolutely agree that considering outputs and measurement, not just inputs, process, and policy and programs, is critical to this dialogue and where this is all going. 100% agree with that, and I think companies need these types of outputs and measurements when they're doing their human rights impact assessments, and when they're creating their inputs, when they're creating their policies, programs, processes, and procedures to address these issues. So 100%, I think that you guys are on the right course here with this. I think from a brand perspective, I think the biggest maybe questions will come up, and also for regulators as well, is that assuming that we were to sort of adopt these particular metrics, I think the first question will be like, well, if you take them one by one, some of them more than others, they don't necessarily in and of themselves mean that something the, say, brand or the buyer is doing wrong. They maybe taken in conjunction with one another, they could be an indicator that they may be doing something wrong, or that their business model is corrupt, or whatever you want to call it. So I think from a brand perspective, their first thing is going to be like, well, what does this actually mean? Is there a benchmark that goes along with these metrics so that I know that, oh, I should have a target of a certain number of my factories that have CBAs, that have unions? And what does that mean for me? Am I now promoting unionization within my supply chain? Do I need to? So I think that those will be the quick questions, like how and what is my mark? What are my goals here that relate to these metrics? And ultimately, that will be determined, I think, by the regulators. They'll look at these metrics and say, based on the profile of this company and their metrics, this is bad, that's okay, that's amazing. That's a critical piece to this puzzle, which I'm sure you guys have thought through. But I think thinking through what those benchmarks are, if any, is really critical. And then the last bit, and maybe more of a question for you guys too. Well, to answer your question, Jason, most of this data, as you guys point out in the paper, is available. And if it's not available, it can be harnessed or harvested in some way. There's so much data floating around out there. It's a question of what are you pulling out? I think the bigger question is of what quality is that data? There is so much corruption that's going on in the social auditing industry out there that I would say half the data out there is sort of junk. So that's a whole nother separate topic that you guys address, I think, in part of your metrics. But something that is of real concern, I think, should be for regulators. Yeah, I was going to say, question for you guys was, how does this tie into some of the enforcement mechanisms that we're seeing being used, like rebuttable presumption in the U.S. with customs? I know the D, the EU is talking about rebuttable presumption as an enforcement mechanism for what they see in the future. So I just wonder how those sort of might tie together in your thinking going forward. Sorry, too much there, too much to bite off.
Right, that's good. Sarosh, do you want to take 2 minutes and react to any of that, and then we'll do another round?
Yeah, I wanted to react to a couple of things. One is that we have to remember that for the EU regulators, this is also something new, right? So I was just last week talking with the Norwegian regulators. Norway has a law too. And they're sort of saying, okay, most of the Norwegian companies are not meeting the requirements of the legislation today. And so we are going to go easy on implementation until we feel comfortable that they are actually getting there. So the point is that this is not regulators, it's not a fixed point in time and they're going to stick to that. Their guidance is going to evolve. And so even if the regulators don't require these metrics, but the law requires that companies actually have to do the due diligence, right? That's the purpose of due diligence law. And doing due diligence means collecting some of these metrics. If you want to prove that there is gender equality in the supply chain, how do you prove that? Or how do you know it's a risk? Because you're supposed to identify your risk, publish that, and then explain how you're going to remedy that risk. And for the next year, you're going to show the effectiveness of your remedy. This is what the German law requires today. So yeah, so I think that collecting this kind of information is really useful for companies. But with some time, regulators could get stricter and stricter, or they could provide more and more guidance about. So I think companies are in good shape if they were able to collect this data. And as you point out, many firms actually already collect this data. It's just that they don't publish it on their website because there was no requirement to publish it on their website. And the last tables in the report show that examples of companies that actually collect the data but not necessarily report on it. I'll stop there and then maybe address questions, Jason.
Yeah, well, let's do one more quick round with the panelists. I'd like to get them reacting to this question. Okay, so we assume that these metrics are available, that the data can be had. What are the obstacles? And this is a question maybe first for Samira. What are the obstacles to getting these metrics into the mainstream of corporate reporting? What's sort of in the way, and what happens if a due diligence system, for example, is built but doesn't include outcome metrics like these?
Thank you very much. Well, I think what's the most exciting now about the times here in the EU and having this legislation into place, so the CSDDD and the forced labor ban will come too, is it's going to be exciting, because I think in a way it's also going to be an experiment for the legislators and for the ones that are going to work on the implementation, the competent authorities that are going to monitor and enforce. A lot of data is already available. So what you do see in the area of CSDDD, but also the forced labor ban regulation, is that a lot of data, a lot of evidence is already being used, and through multi-stakeholder dialogues, for example, and all the experts that are consulted and all the available information. So you'll definitely see development now of databases, of portals even, that will incorporate all the relevant data and information. But I think the most challenging is going to be the implementation and how it's going to specifically translate into certain measurements, into certain projects, the cooperation when it comes to enforcement. So how are competent authorities, but also member states in this regard, how are they going to connect, communicate with each other, and make sure that they share relevant expertise, knowledge, and data? And this is where the challenge really comes in. So that means that there needs to be strong coordinated cooperation, strong coordinated sharing of knowledge and expertise. For example, I take the forced labor ban regulation now. I know that there's going to be a so-called union network that will be established from the Commission side to make sure that all the competent authorities and relevant stakeholders come together to gather data, to also work on data, to track and monitor also trends, to make sure that in this union network, really relevant knowledge and expertise is being shared. And I think also with CSDDD, such structures and platform creation will happen and need to happen, because at the end, we very much depend on how it's all going to translate into practice. And having the data is already one thing, but the second thing is that we really need to make it work, and this is where the challenge is going to be. And let's not underestimate also the importance of the multilateral cooperation here, because I think there's also a challenge, but there's a good opportunity for several multilateral organizations to work in this area, to share knowledge. There is also an opportunity, I believe, among like-minded countries, different countries, to see where they can harmonize also certain measures in the area of corporate accountability, but also forced labor.
Okay, good. Thank you, Samira. Dheeraj or Shahnaz, James, do you want to get in?
I will be very brief. Just like in terms of challenges, or if such matrices are missing, then what can happen? Like it's what we are seeing already. Like there's a lot of focuses on environment-related factors, and what we understand that when you have measures focused on certain things, then investments get drawn to that, and that's where we do see challenge that if such matrices are missing from mainstream models of assessments, then we may not have understanding in terms of what is missing in social part, or what is missing when it comes to investment on labor aspects. And that's one big piece of challenge that I see if such matrices are missing from the mainstream. Second is also important is to bring in some critical aspects, because we have seen when over last decade, when environment movement and investor movement was not coming together, and it took this crisis to understand that how it needs to work together. And similarly, what is happening at this stage that social this movement and investors movement are again at two different going in two different directions. And that's where what happens that many, I feel, softer issues start getting into labor or social matrices, rather than talking about hard issues around, let's say, inequality or collective bargaining or freedom of association, rather than what we'll see movement towards issues around, let's say, community development by companies. So that's the two challenges that I see if such narratives are missing.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Dheeraj. Shahnaz or James, do you want to add something?
Hello.
Oh, sorry.
Shahnaz,
I'm sorry.
go ahead.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mikhail. The challenges which would be very prominent will be first is the informal sector. Second would be lack of less established supply chain and informal business relationships. Another important factor would be to align with the approach of the UNGP and OECD guidelines. And one major challenge would again be this, the capacity building and technical guidance, both to the throughout the supply chain, I should say, including the workers. And another major thing would be the labor laws, how it would be applicable in context to India, where labor falls in the concurrent list, and it varies from state to state. Every federal state has a different law. We are really looking forward to the living wage as a beacon of hope for equitable labor practices and fair wages. And we look forward to the brands also to take efforts in this living wage journey.
Okay.
Last but sorry.
Go ahead, Prakash, last thing.
Sorry, ensuring regulatory compliance and enhancing the operational efficiency would again be a great challenge for almost all stakeholders. Thank you.
All right, good. James, do you want to?
I'll just add one more.
Want to react, and then we've got questions stacking up.
Yeah, just one and it sort of challenge I think with brand programs is as you guys point out in your paper, there is this built up involuntary world that has been created for the past 25 years, and I think without really clear guidance of really what needs to be done exactly. Brands are sort of looking at this law and that law and this regulatory environment and this enforcement mechanism, and they're like, I think that there's a lot of hangover that needs to be dealt with these involuntary programs. I think that collecting this kind of data is not a big deal, to be honest. I think it's them holding on tight to something that they did in the past, thinking that it has value, when in reality, the reason, as you pointed, the reason we have these laws is because those programs have limited value. And so that migration is going to be, that's a big challenge that we're all going to go through together here. But like any corporate is always going to say, I need clear, tell me exactly what I need to do. So to the extent that we're still sort of in this sort of transitional phase, it'll make it a little bit tougher.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, and maybe I'll just throw in one, the temptation to match every element of a very complex framework like OECD guidelines with a metric all its own. That's how we get to, that's how we get to 587 measures. And as Sarosh said, we were militant about getting this down to 25. That's that's part of the point of the exercise. Okay, we've got questions stacking up in the Q&A. If you've got questions, type them in. Sarosh, we've got a few there that are technical about quality of audit data, about scoring systems. Do you want to tackle a couple, summarize the question, and then have a crack at it?
Yeah. So I have two questions that are related. One is, how would you recommend that brands collect these metrics? There are so many tools in this space, and we want to reduce burdens on suppliers. And a second related question is, audits have failed workers many times. So how trustworthy or reliable is auditor collected data about things like workplace violations? And so this goes back to the question of, brands are responsible for collecting intelligence about their supply chain, right? Under the new laws, if they don't collect information about their supply chain, but there is a violation, they can be held liable. Somebody in Bangladesh, for example, could sue a European company in the European courts for violating something. So brands don't have a choice here. They have to collect information and intelligence. Now, how they do this, they could rely on audits, but it means that audits have a bad reputation, but it means that auditing companies have to up their game. It might mean that audits will become more expensive. Brands will have to pay more. Auditors will have to spend more time. They will have to be better trained, which is why we want transparency. And one of our measures is, telling us who did the audit. And remember, there is, under the new regime, even auditors can be sued, right? So if brands are relying on audits to get their intelligence, then that quality of that information would have to increase. Otherwise, maybe brands will be developing long-term good relationships based on partnership with buyers and suppliers. That may be a useful way in which they can collect intelligence. Maybe they can rely on local NGOs. There are different ways that brands can collect this information. So yes, but there is no question, if they are relying on audits, then the auditing system has to really upgrade themselves. And I think the threat of a lawsuit and the fact that that you will be held liable is going to get everybody to improve their game. So that's a key element in this. How do brands get information? Maybe it is also important for brands to understand better what goes on in their supply chain, even if they do not do audits. They have to find another means of doing that. Another question that has come up is a little technical. This is about to what extent do you have shouldn't you have a metric on freedom of association that actually looks at whether workers are elected, union leaders are elected? And so here, that's a classic question. We would have liked to have measures about whether union representatives are elected, but we could have maybe 5, 10 different measures on various freedom of association issues. And we thought that we want to limit it, to boil them down to sort of the most important measures in some sense. And our measure about activist unions negotiating, genuine collective bargaining agreements takes into account, it's a proxy for the fact that the union is, democratic and activist. So it's a proxy, and it's important to sort of look at the measures in relation to each other, freedom of association and collective bargaining. Together, we're looking at genuine collective bargaining agreements. So these are kind of proxies for democratic union elections. Okay. I have, how can we increase sharing of information and efficiency when there is a whole business ecosystem built around auditing, data collection? They have little incentive to centralize. That's a good question, but remember that the European laws now require companies to sort of publish on their website their risks, the risks that they consider significant. So there is going to be a higher degree of transparency, and that may lead to best practices and everybody understanding what's an acceptable risk, what's not, what's risk, and how they're going to deal with that. The next year, the second year of the legislation, each of the companies is going to have to show how they have remedied that risk. So we are getting into an arena where all of this information is more public, and therefore there's increased sharing of information and potentially sharing of best practices.
Sarosh, a question about scoring. You want to tackle that one?
Yeah.
Let's say data is collected on all these 25 measures, how does a regulator, how does a brand, how does a union, through disclosure of the data, do the math and come up with an answer about the risk that each of these firms presents?
So it is possible it's important to first say that, regulators thus far are not yet interested in scoring. They are currently focused on, getting some companies to identify the risks. It is possible that with the use of metrics, regulators could become interested in scoring. We have developed a scoring system that allows us to sort of aggregate all of the scores on the workforce and working conditions and supply chain metrics. This scoring system would be based on what the average is for each of these scores, aggregated into a total score. It's not possible to create a scoring system on the sourcing metrics, but it's possible to create scoring system on all of the others. And we are happy to work with companies and actually to create scoring systems if they are interested. The regulators have not yet expressed any interest in creating scoring systems, but they could in the future.
Okay, thanks. And just a coda on adaptation of this system, which we devised with apparel in mind for fishing or other sectors where work looks a little different. I think the metrics would be by and large the same. We could swap in a few that are anomalous. Fishing, for example, takes place often miles and miles away in deep water. So that might require the introduction of a different metric. But in the scoring, the regulator would dial up or down the issues that are most important for that sector. So in fishing, for example, you might dial up the scoring or the impact of forced labor findings, or for example, safety and health, common issues in commercial fishing. Okay. So we're almost at the limit. We've got 5 minutes. I want to go back to our panelists and ask them for any final thoughts. No question, just final reactions to what you've heard today and what you're looking forward to. Samira, you want to start?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, I think it's very obvious that this is a very interesting first start of how to make all these rules and legislation more concrete for companies. At the end, companies, the industries, firms, etc., they need to be part of all this effort to make sure that we have a good and a positive impact on human rights and labor rights. And this is very much part of the whole discussion, I believe, on how to reform global labor governance, meaning that we need to find ways, concrete tools and solutions to make it pragmatic for companies that need to work with it and that are part of that solution. So it's very obvious that we have a lot of untapped opportunities here, and also to discuss more and more with companies and all the stakeholders how we can bring it to a bigger public, I'd say. And like I said, the challenge here now is that, okay, we have several judicial frameworks in the world. You see several countries working on due diligence, on forced labor. So it means that a new kind of international order is going to exist now in this area of corporate accountability. And the main challenge here now is, okay, how are we going to bring all these organizations and countries together to see where we can harmonize measures, to see where we can learn from each other, to share knowledge, to share expertise. And these metrics can really help to make it a pragmatic discussion, to make it a more precise discussion. Because on the one hand, I recognize and I see also as producing that legislation myself, that a lot of papers are coming and a lot of administrative burden maybe are coming to so many companies. And if we want to encourage them, and if we want to truly support them also technically, then this is really the way to think about concrete and pragmatic tools that can help companies. So I think the answer is also with the companies and with all the other stakeholders that can work with such tools. So I'm very much looking forward also to having more of these dialogues with all the relevant stakeholders to receive the feedback, to learn from the feedback, and see how we can implement. And it would already be, a very good step if we can start to implement certain metrics and to see how that all evolves and how that works out in practice. Depending, I think, also on the kind of company and the kind of stakeholder you're talking about, I can imagine that certain metrics will be more relevant or more important or more crucial even to report on. And I can also imagine that that in the future maybe a priority, an order. How can we think about the certain order and prioritization of these metrics for companies? So these are all my thoughts based on the discussion we had today. But
All right.
obviously, we have a lot of interesting challenges here. Thank you.
Yeah, a lot more to do. Okay, Dheeraj, Shahnaz, James, we've got just a minute. So if you've got something you want to throw in, please do. But be brief.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Adding on, companies should come out with a human rights policy and environmental policy, because these are the two major categories of risks. Regarding complaint mechanism, companies and associations should have independent complaint mechanism and reviewing, so that they can review their own grievance procedures. And they should be a policy mechanism and implementation details, which could be very transparent. Major important aspect is the disclosure. So these are my points on my behalf.
All right, good.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Dheeraj or James?
I have a very brief point. I think it's a very good start, and if this measurement can help us liberate from the larger measurement industry, because somewhere I feel it creates very complex systems around measurement and starts working in silos with very vested interests. So that's where I see a lot of scope for this metrics, which can challenge that structure. And for auditing and all, we have already tried to touch upon those challenges. So looking forward, and there's a need to build ecosystem around these matrices so that there's more transparency and engagement with data, which will further strengthen the quality. Thank you.
Okay, great. James, last word.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to thank you guys for kicking this dialogue off. I think it's absolutely, you guys are on to something super important. I'm really, really curious to hear the feedback you guys get from not only this session, but also these metrics and publishing them. I think this is the right dialogue to be having. And so I wanted to thank you. And as the others have said, looking forward to more dialogue and seeing how this can play a role in the evolution of this movement. So thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you all four of you, Samira, Dheeraj, Shahnaz, James. And thank you to Sarosh for laying those out so carefully. I want to invite all of you listening still to send us your reactions. We're happy to get by email your thoughts on these metrics. They are, in a sense, open source, but we're gonna keep refining them, and we're of course hungry for data that will allow us to run this little machine and improve the way it works. Sarosh, last word.
Yeah, just saying we are working with companies to collect data. There is a lot of data out there. Many companies collect it, even if they don't report it. And so we welcome expressions of interest. We analyze company data and feed it back to the company so that they can improve their programs. In particular, the more data that we get, it's better for the entire ecosystem, regulators, and others, other stakeholders, so to sort of see the variation. So given that we are in a new age, watershed moment, we have mandatory due diligence, new age of transparency, the more data that is shared, the better.
Yeah, and not just by firms, but by workers, an untapped source of vital intelligence about workplace goings on, workplace practices, good and bad, are workers themselves. And then finally, one audience for this. We've spent a lot of time talking about the European Union and the moves they've made in the last, in recent months. But we haven't talked much about the US government. This may have less value over at CBP, for example, where they're looking for something very, very specific and forensic, but more use perhaps over at the SEC, where what we're aiming for is a labor social equivalent of the 10K, a quantitative and specific measure of the overall health of the firm. So SEC, we're waiting for your call. Okay, thank you all again. This has been good. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to Sarosh. Thank you to our audience. Please send us your reactions. So long.